Can you work out the most unappreciated Japanese games with statistics? This is game researcher Akito Inoue, and for the last few years, that's one of the questions he's been trying to answer. His method works like this. Take, for example, Shadow of the Colossus, and check how many times it's been listed in as many Western sources as you can find. Sales charts, lists of award recipients, museum collections, books of the best games ever. If you see it in any of these dozens of lists, make a note of it. The more times it appears, the higher the game's overall profile. Then do some maths, not going to get into that, that produces a number out of a possible 100. Of course, it doesn't necessarily follow that the game with the highest score is the best game ever made. There's no objective way to determine that. It only means that it appeared in more lists than any other game. Hopefully, the number serves as a rough measure of the impact a game had in the West, how well known and well thought of it is. Then do the same exercise again, with dozens more lists, but with one significant difference. This time, all the sources are Japanese. You get another number out of 100, this one an approximation of the game's cultural footprint in Japan. With those two numbers, you can place the game on a graph with those two axes, and do the same thing for all 1400 games that appear at least once. You'll end up with a chart like this. In the top right, we find games that have a high profile in both hemispheres, like Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, Zelda: A Link to the Past, and the first-gen Pokemon games. In the opposite corner, games whose impact on either side of the world was modest. They're good, and maybe even classics. Everything on this chart has achieved recognition, but their acclaim is far from universal. But along the left edge, we find games that are regarded favourably in the West, but less so in Japan. Here we find Half-Life 2, Myst, World of Warcraft, Civilization, and Doom. Either these games are undervalued in Japan, overvalued in the West, or perhaps a bit of both. And along the bottom edge, games with a larger cultural footprint in Japan than in the West. This is where Europeans and Americans can find Japanese classics that only aficionados might be familiar with. Let's look at an example of what this graph can tell us. Here are the Final Fantasy games. It's obvious that Final Fantasy VII is the clear leader of the pack in both Japan and the West, but the rest are scattered. Games like 2, 3, and 12 have a higher profile in Japan, while 5 is surprisingly low ranked, and the only game more popular in the West is Final Fantasy Tactics. Where do the Zelda games fall? All over the map. Zelda 2, which received mixed reviews in the West, is in Japan the highest rated of the series. There are many reasons that games might fall into this bigger in Japan zone. For some, it's as simple as never being released in the West, like Daigyakuten Saiban, an unlocalized Phoenix Wright spin-off, the PlayStation fighting game Tobal 2, Love Plus and New Love Plus, dating sims for Nintendo handhelds, and Derby Stallion, a series of popular horse racing management sims that's never left Japan. Other games, like Panzer Dragoon Saga and Spy on the Sega Saturn, and Ys 1 and 2 on the PC Engine, were only available on platforms that failed in Western markets, so they remain relatively obscure. Other titles missed their moment, and released in the West until decades later, condemning them to an underrated existence as a retro game, rather than being appreciated in their day. In this category, we can put Shin Megami Tensei, and Final Fantasy 2 and 3. Some of the games in this corner were released in the West but have niche appeal, like Yokai Watch, or Gravity Rush on the Vita, which appears in no Western lists but is high on the Japanese scale, as is the RPG Tales of Zestiria. Of the games with the highest ratings in Japan, but a low or zero rating in the West, Dragon Quest is the name that appears repeatedly. Though the series is gaining worldwide popularity, even the most hyped games in the West can't hope to rival the scale of the phenomenon in Japan. These are just a handful of observations from this collection of stats. You can download the entire dataset from Akito Inoue's site and provide data for the next version of his model by filling in some quick surveys. Numbers alone tell no stories, but they can hint at a story's existence. A surprising data point can spark curiosity and be the gateway to a mystery. Why is Super Mario World more popular in the West? Why is Left 4 Dead so popular in Japan? Why is Ocarina of Time the most beloved Zelda game in the West, while in Japan, it barely squeaks into the top 5. I've no idea. Maybe these are just errors or artifacts, or maybe they're more than that. The data on its own doesn't have the answers, but it can point us towards intriguing questions, or at the very least, bring to light some new games to try. There's a link to Akito Inoue's site in the description, along with links to Moby Games entries for some games that are big only in Japan, some I've mentioned and a bunch of others too. As always, this video was made possible by generous Patreon backers. If you want to join them and help me make more videos, for as little as $1, click the card on screen or the link in the description. And thanks to you for watching, sharing and supporting Retro Histories. I'll see you again in the past.